The town of Maple Ridge, Oregon, had a way of swallowing people whole, not in violence or drama, but in the quiet erosion of ambition, the gradual acceptance that some lives were meant to be small. Ethan Mercer had become one of those lives. 36 years old, hands scarred from metal and heat, hair threaded with premature silver that caught the morning light like wire. He crouched beneath a John Deere combine harvester in Bennett's repair shop, replacing a hydraulic line that had burst 3 days prior, and the work filled his mind with the clean simplicity of cause and effect. Pressure exceeded tolerance. Metal fatigued. Fluid escaped. Fix the seal, bleed the line, test the system. No board meetings, no quarterly projections. No one died if he made a mistake. The shop smelled of oil and rust and the particular sweetness of old wood soaked in decades of spilled gasoline. Bennett himself, 63 and weathered as the beams overhead, stood at the workbench filing down a carburetor, housing, metal shavings falling like snow onto the scarred plywood surface. 3 other bays held vehicles in various states of disassembly, a Ford pickup with its transmission scattered across a tarp, a riding mower missing its deck, a grain auger with a seized bearing. Ethan had fixed them all in the 8 years he'd worked here. Fixed everything anyone brought him, never complained. Never asked for more than the hourly rate Bennett paid in cash every Friday afternoon. Sophie sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket near the tool cabinet, her homework spread across her lap on a clipboard. 7 years old, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, eyes that saw everything her ears couldn't hear. She chewed the end of her pencil as she worked through multiplication problems, occasionally glancing up to watch her father's boots protruding from beneath the harvester. The world came to her in silence. Always had, but she'd learned to read its rhythms in ways most people never needed. The vibration of footsteps through concrete, the shift in air pressure when doors open, the tension in shoulders and the tightness around eyes that signaled anger or fear or joy. Right now, her father was calm, focused, the way he always was when his hands were busy solving problems machines presented. Ethan slid out from under the harvester, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had long ago surrendered to permanent staining. He caught Sophie watching him and signed with oil-blackened fingers. Almost done. 10 minutes. She signed back. I'm hungry. He smiled, the expression softening the hard edges worry had carved into his face over the years. Soon. Promise. Bennett looked over from his workbench, watching the exchange without understanding the words but recognizing the language. The old man had never asked why Ethan had appeared in Maple Ridge 8 years ago, with a 2-year-old deaf daughter and no explanation beyond needing work. Some men arrived in small towns running from something. Some arrived because they'd run as far as they could go. Bennett had learned not to ask which was which. The sound of tires on gravel pulled everyone's attention toward the open bay door. Not the familiar crunch of pickup trucks or the rattle of farm equipment trailers, but the smooth hush of expensive rubber meeting stone. The vehicle that appeared was an Audi Q7, black as oil, its surface reflecting the weak November sunlight in liquid curves. It rolled to a stop in the parking area with the quiet confidence of German engineering and money that didn't need to announce itself. Ethan felt his stomach tighten, a response he couldn't name but recognized from somewhere deep in his past. Vehicles like that didn't come to Bennett's repair. Not for service, not for directions, not for anything that belonged in a town of 4,200 people where the fanciest car was the Methodist pastor's 10-year-old Lexus. The driver's door opened and a woman emerged, 31, maybe 32, dressed in charcoal slacks and a blazer that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. Her hair was light brown with honey highlights, pulled back in a low ponytail that suggested efficiency over style. She wore minimal makeup and flat shoes, as if she'd consciously decided to minimize the gap between herself and the environment she was entering. It didn't work. Everything about her screamed city, money, corporate boardrooms, where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made over catered lunches. She walked toward the open bay with measured steps, her eyes scanning the interior of the shop, with the assessment of someone trained to evaluate assets and liabilities. Her gaze moved across the dismantled pickup, the grain auger, Bennett at his workbench, and finally landed on Ethan, still holding the grease-stained rag, still half-crouched beside the combine harvester. The woman stopped 6 feet away, and Ethan watched recognition dawn in her eyes even as his own mind struggled to place her. She wasn't someone he'd met, He was certain of that, but there was something familiar in her bearing. The set of her shoulders, the way she held her hands clasped in front of her like a shield against informality. Ethan Mercer, the words weren't a question. Or maybe you prefer Ethan Cole these days. The rag slipped from Ethan's fingers. He felt Sophie's attention sharpen, the way a deer's ears swivel toward a breaking twig. Bennett had stopped filing, the rasp of metal on metal falling silent. Depends on who's asking. His voice came out rougher than intended. My name is Natalie Hartwell. I'm the CEO of Hartwell Industries. She paused, watching his face for reaction. I believe you worked for one of our subsidiary companies about 8 years ago, Apex Dynamics. The name detonated in Ethan's chest like a small explosive charge, the kind used in controlled demolitions to bring down buildings floor by floor. Apex Dynamics, he hadn't heard those words spoken aloud in nearly a decade, had trained himself to seal them away in a compartment of his mind marked "Do Not Open." But memory was never that obedient. It flooded back in fragments, fluorescent-lit conference rooms, PowerPoint presentations on hydraulic system failures, the particular weight of a manila folder full of calculations no one wanted to acknowledge, and Marcus Webb's face in the grainy newspaper photo, 34 years old, survived by a wife and 2 children, the youngest barely 6 months old when her father died. I fix tractors now. Whatever you're looking for, you've got the wrong guy. Natalie Hartwell reached into her bag, a leather satchel that probably cost more than Sophie's school supplies for the year, and withdrew a manila folder. The sight of it made Ethan's hands clench involuntarily. I've spent 5 months trying to find you. You're not an easy man to track down, Mr. Mercer. Or Mr. Cole. The personnel file says you resigned voluntarily, but I've spoken to people who worked with you. They tell a different story. People talk. Doesn't mean they know anything. Sophie had set down her clipboard and was signing to her father, her small hands moving with urgent precision. Ethan read the question in her gestures, but didn't look away from Natalie Hartwell as he signed back. Everything's okay. Stay there. The exchange lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but Natalie Hartwell caught it, her eyes moving between father and daughter with an expression Ethan couldn't quite decode. Your daughter, she's deaf. Ethan felt heat rise in his chest, the protective anger that came whenever someone treated Sophie's deafness as a problem requiring comment. She's right here. You can talk to her directly. Natalie Hartwell's composure flickered, a crack in the professional veneer. She turned towards Sophie and spoke with exaggerated clarity, her lips forming each word with the precision of someone who'd read about deaf communication but never actually practiced it. Hello, I'm Natalie. I work with computers and machines. Sophie studied the woman with the unblinking assessment children deploy when adults enter their space uninvited. She signed to her father without acknowledging Natalie's words. Ethan translated, keeping his voice flat. She says you have nice shoes, but you don't smile like most people who come here. The observation landed with more accuracy than any technical critique Natalie Hartwell had likely received in corporate meetings. She looked at Sophie again, and this time something shifted in her expression, a recognition that she'd been evaluated and found wanting by a 7-year-old who saw more than adults preferred. She's perceptive. She has to be. Ethan finally took the folder from Natalie's extended hand, though he didn't open it. What do you actually want, Miss Hartwell? Because I'm pretty sure you didn't drive 3 hours from Boston to compliment my daughter. I'm based in Portland now, actually. Moved the primary office 6 months ago. So only 90 minutes. But your point stands. Natalie's voice lost some of its corporate smoothness, as if the prepared speech she'd rehearsed during the drive had hit an obstacle it couldn't navigate. I want to understand what happened at Apex Dynamics in 2016. Specifically, I want to understand what happened to the safety protocols you designed for the TX7 production line. Ethan's jaw tightened hard enough to make his teeth ache. That was a long time ago. Not long enough, apparently. Natalie's tone softened slightly, though whether from genuine concern or strategic calculation remained unclear. I inherited Hartwell Industries from my father 18 months ago when he died. I've spent that time trying to understand every division, every subsidiary, every decision that shaped this company. And I keep finding your name in places where it should still be but isn't, in files that reference work that never got credited, in memo threads that end abruptly. Your name keeps appearing and then disappearing, like someone tried to erase you but didn't quite finish the job. My name got erased for a reason I'd very much like to understand. She glanced at Sophie, then back at Ethan, and something in her calculations seemed to shift. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private. Ethan looked at his daughter, at the homework spread across her lap, at the familiar safety of Bennett's repair shop that had become their refuge from a world that took too much and gave back too little. Then he looked at the folder in his hands, at the weight of a past he tried to bury under 8 years of hydraulic lines and carburetor adjustments in the simple mathematics of survival. There's a diner across the street. Rosie's. Sophie likes their grilled cheese sandwiches. We can talk there, but she comes with me. Natalie nodded, and something in her posture suggested this wasn't the response she'd expected, but perhaps the one she should have anticipated. I'll follow you over. The walk across Main Street took less than 2 minutes, but Ethan felt the weight of every step. Sophie held his hand, her small fingers warm in his calloused palm, and signed with her free hand. Is the shoe lady bad? He signed back as they reached the crosswalk. I don't know yet, but we'll be careful. Rosie's Diner occupied a converted craftsman house that had been serving breakfast and lunch to Maple Ridge for 43 years. The interior smelled of coffee and bacon grease and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had fed multiple generations. Booths lined the walls with red vinyl seats patched here and there with duct tape. The lunch rush was still 2 hours away, leaving the dining room mostly empty, except for 2 farmers having coffee at the counter and old Walter Briggs reading the Oregonian in his usual corner booth. Maggie, the owner's daughter and primary waitress, looked up from refilling the coffee station and smiled at Sophie before her eyes caught on Natalie Hartwell entering behind them. The smile didn't fade but acquired a question mark. She led them to a booth in the back corner without comment. The usual for you and Sophie? Please. Ethan settled Sophie on the bench beside him, helping her arrange her crayons and coloring book that Maggie had already placed on the table without being asked. And for your friend, just coffee. Black. Natalie slid into the opposite bench, placing her leather satchel beside her. Maggie departed with a nod, and the silence that settled over the booth carried the weight of 8 years and 3,000 miles and at least one death that should have been prevented. Ethan opened the folder Natalie had given him and began reading, while Sophie colored a picture of a horse with careful concentration. The documents inside were photocopies, but high-quality ones. His original personnel file from Apex Dynamics, complete with his MIT degree, his hire date, his performance reviews, his resignation letter that said voluntary in capital letters at the top. Beneath that were technical specifications for the TX7 hydraulic production line, the same specifications he'd reviewed in March of 2016 when he'd first identified the cascade failure scenario that no one wanted to acknowledge. His handwritten notes were there too, scanned from originals he'd assumed were destroyed, showing the calculations that demonstrated how 3 seemingly minor variables could combine to create catastrophic pressure buildup under sustained operational load. I designed those safety protocols to prevent exactly one thing. Ethan spoke quietly, aware that Sophie couldn't hear the conversation but would pick up on his tension if he let it show too much. Catastrophic failure of the hydraulic compression system under sustained load. I ran the numbers 100 times. I presented my findings to management. I told them the production timeline was too aggressive, that we needed another 6 months of testing. And they disagreed. They didn't disagree. They buried it. Ethan closed the folder and met Natalie's eyes directly. 3 weeks after they overrode my recommendations, the TX7 line went into production. 2 months after that, a compression failure killed a worker named Marcus Webb, 34 years old, father of 2. The youngest was 6 months old. Sophie couldn't hear the words, but she read the shift in her father's posture with the fluency of someone who'd learned that bodies told truths, mouths often hid. She set down her crayon and placed her small hand on Ethan's forearm, a gesture of comfort she'd learned to offer when the world pressed too hard against the man who was her entire universe. The official investigation blamed operator error. Natalie's voice had lost its corporate polish, settling into something more human. I read the report. It concluded that Marcus Webb ignored multiple safety warnings and failed to follow proper shutdown procedures when he noticed the pressure anomaly. The official investigation was bought and paid for. They needed a scapegoat, and Marcus couldn't defend himself anymore. So they blamed him for ignoring safety warnings that my protocols would have made automatic. Ethan's voice remained level through pure force of will. I tried to go public. I talked to 3 labor attorneys, all of whom declined to take the case. I contacted a reporter at the Portland Tribune who wrote a preliminary article that got killed for legal reasons the day before publication. I filed a complaint with OSHA that disappeared into a black hole. One by one, everyone stopped listening. Precision Dynamics made it very clear that my career was over, that no one in the industry would ever hire me again, and that if I kept talking, they would find ways to make my life even more difficult. So you disappeared. I protected my daughter. There's a difference. Ethan glanced at Sophie, who had returned to coloring but kept her hand on his arm. My wife Rachel died in a car accident 2 months after Marcus Webb. Sophie was 2 years old. After that, everything else stopped mattering. The fight, the career, the need to be right. All that mattered was making sure Sophie was safe and cared for and never had to feel alone in the silence the way I felt alone in the noise. Natalie was quiet for a long moment, her untouched coffee cooling in its mug. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight it hadn't before. I'm sorry for your wife, for everything that happened after, for the way my company, my father's company, treated you. Don't apologize for things you didn't do. Just don't pretend you understand. I'm not pretending anything. I'm trying to learn. Natalie leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table. My father built Hartwell Industries from nothing. Gerald Hartwell. He was brilliant and ruthless and completely incapable of admitting when he was wrong. He died 18 months ago, and I inherited a company full of problems he never acknowledged and mistakes he never fixed. I've spent every day since trying to untangle decisions that were made for quarterly earnings instead of long-term sustainability. And your case keeps appearing in my research like a ghost I can't lay to rest. Maggie arrived with Sophie's grilled cheese sandwich, cut into triangles the way the girl liked it, and Ethan's usual BLT. She set them down with practiced efficiency and departed without interrupting the conversation she clearly sensed was not meant for wider audience. Sophie picked up a triangle of grilled cheese and began eating, watching Natalie with the steady gaze of a child deciding whether to grant provisional trust. After a moment, she signed something to her father. Ethan translated with a hint of a smile despite the heaviness in his chest. She wants to know if you like grilled cheese. Natalie looked directly at Sophie this time, speaking clearly but without the exaggerated mouth movements from before. I do. It's one of my favorite foods. Sophie studied her for 3 more seconds, then returned to eating. Provisional trust apparently granted, though subject to revocation at any moment. Why are you telling me all this? Ethan hadn't touched his sandwich. Why now? Why track me down after 8 years? Natalie hesitated, and for the first time since walking into Bennett's repair shop, she looked uncertain. Because history's about to repeat itself, and this time I need someone who understands exactly what went wrong before. The words settled into Ethan's stomach like lead weight. He felt the old familiar pressure building in his chest, the burden of knowledge that had nearly destroyed him once before. I think you should leave. I appreciate you telling me the truth, Miss Hartwell, but I'm not the person you're looking for anymore. I fix tractors and make breakfast for my daughter and help with homework. That's my life. That's all my life can be. Natalie didn't argue. She simply placed a business card on the table beside the untouched coffee. The new production line goes live in 6 weeks. If you change your mind, you know how to reach me. She stood, placed $20 on the table to cover a meal she hadn't eaten, and walked out of the diner without looking back. Ethan sat very still, staring at the business card as if it might explode. Sophie tugged at his sleeve and signed a question. Who was that woman? He signed back slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone diffusing ordnance. Someone from a long time ago. Someone who thinks I can help her with a problem. Sophie considered this, then signed again with the devastating clarity only children possess. Do you want to help her? Ethan didn't answer. He picked up the business card, turned it over in his oil-stained fingers, and slipped it into his pocket. Some questions were too heavy to answer in a diner booth on a Tuesday morning when your daughter was eating grilled cheese and waiting for you to finish your shift so you could go home and pretend the past wasn't reaching out to drag you back into its machinery. The week that followed felt like living in a house with structural damage no one else could see. Ethan went through his daily routines with mechanical precision. Waking at 6, making breakfast, driving Sophie to school, working at Bennett's, picking Sophie up at 3, helping with homework, making dinner, reading her stories in sign language before bed. But underneath the routine ran a current of anxiety he couldn't quite suppress. The folder Natalie had left sat in his closet behind boxes of old clothes and forgotten memories, but its presence pulsed through the house like a second heartbeat. He found himself thinking about Marcus Webb at odd moments. While replacing a timing belt on a Ford F-150, wondering if Marcus's daughters remembered their father, or if 6 months had been too young for memory to take root. While making spaghetti for dinner, calculating that Marcus's youngest would be 8 now, a year older than Sophie, old enough to understand what she'd lost. While lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and seeing the cascade failure sequence play out in his mind with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. On Friday afternoon, Natalie Hartwell appeared again. This time she came to the rental house on Maple Street, knocking on the door while Ethan was making dinner and Sophie was practicing her spelling words at the kitchen table. He opened the door with a dish towel in his hand and the immediate rise of defensive walls that had kept him safe for 8 years. "I thought I made myself clear." "You did. I'm not here to pressure you." Natalie held up her empty hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm here because I realized I handled our first meeting badly, and I wanted to apologize." The admission caught Ethan off guard. He'd expected persistence, negotiation, perhaps manipulation. Apology wasn't part of the corporate playbook he remembered. "You drove 90 minutes to apologize?" "I drove 90 minutes because I couldn't stop thinking about what your daughter said about me, about my smile not being real." Natalie's voice was quieter now, stripped of boardroom authority. "I've spent my entire career learning how to control perceptions, how to present exactly the image I want people to see, and a 7-year-old saw through it in 30 seconds. It made me realize I've spent so long wearing masks that I've forgotten what my actual face looks like." Despite himself, Ethan felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "She has that effect on people. May I come in? Just for a few minutes. I promise I'm not here to recruit you." Ethan considered refusing, considered closing the door and returning to the safe predictability of his evening routine. But something in Natalie's expression, a vulnerability she clearly wasn't comfortable showing, made him step aside and let her enter. The house was modest, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, kitchen that opened into a small living room. Sophie's drawings covered the refrigerator in layers, overlapping landscapes and animals and abstract shapes in crayon and marker. A shelf near the door held her collection of painted rocks, each one decorated with careful patterns. The furniture was second-hand but well-maintained, everything arranged to maximize visibility so Sophie could see her father from anywhere in the main living space. Sophie looked up when Natalie entered, her expression guarded. She signed to her father. "The shoe lady is back." Ethan signed his response. "She says she wants to apologize. Be polite." Sophie's skepticism was visible, but she offered a small wave before returning to her spelling words. Provisional trust not yet upgraded to acceptance. Natalie watched the exchange with an expression Ethan couldn't decipher, something between curiosity and longing. "You learned sign language for her." It wasn't a question. "I learned sign language because it's her language. It's how she experiences the world." Ethan moved to the stove, checking on the pasta sauce that was beginning to simmer. Most people treat her deafness like a problem to be solved, something that needs to be fixed or overcome. I decided a long time ago to treat it like a different way of being human. She's not less than anyone else. She's just different, and different doesn't need fixing. Natalie was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "I looked into your background more thoroughly after our meeting. You had offers from every major engineering firm in the country when you graduated MIT. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Electric, Tesla. You could have worked anywhere, done anything. I could have done a lot of things. Life had other plans." Ethan stirred the sauce, his back to her. "My wife died when Sophie was 2. Car accident. After that, everything else seemed less important. Work, ambition, proving myself to people who didn't care whether I lived or died. When Apex Dynamics made it clear that my career was over, I didn't fight as hard as I could have. I was tired. I was alone with a toddler who couldn't hear me tell her I loved her until I learned how to say it with my hands. I made a choice to stop chasing things that didn't matter and start protecting what did. Natalie sat down at the kitchen table, her expensive blazer looking absurdly out of place against the worn wooden chairs. Sophie glanced at her with renewed curiosity, sensing something had shifted in the emotional temperature of the room. I'm sorry, for your wife, for everything that happened after. I know you told me not to apologize for things I didn't do, but I need you to know I understand why you walked away, why you built this life, and I'm not asking you to give it up. Then what are you asking? Natalie folded her hands on the table, and for the first time she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman carrying burdens she hadn't asked for. My father built Hartwell Industries from nothing. He started with a machine shop in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1982 and turned it into a company that employs 5,000 people. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, but he was also ruthless in ways I didn't understand until after he died. He made decisions based on quarterly earnings and shareholder value and contracts that couldn't be allowed to fail, and he never looked back at the human cost of those decisions. He died 18 months ago and left me a company that's structurally profitable but morally compromised in ways I'm still discovering. Ethan turned from the stove, studying her face for signs of manipulation or calculated vulnerability. He found only exhaustion and something that might have been shame. The new production line I mentioned, Natalie continued, the TX9, it's based on a design that's almost identical to the TX7. Same basic architecture, same pressure tolerances, same potential failure points. And the same people who overrode your safety recommendations 8 years ago are now in charge of the entire division. Vincent Carver, he was division head at Apex when Marcus Webb died. Now he's VP of operations at Hartwell, overseeing all manufacturing. Then fire him. I tried. The board blocked me. Natalie's voice carried an edge of frustration she couldn't quite suppress. Carver has contracts, 20 years of seniority, relationships with major shareholders. He spent the last 2 years convincing the board that I'm too young and too inexperienced to understand how things really work in manufacturing. That I'm trying to fix problems that don't exist because I'm more concerned with optics than operational reality. I'm fighting a war inside my own company, Mr. Mercer, and I'm losing. Sophie had stopped pretending to do her homework and was now watching the conversation with open interest. She signed to her father. She looks sad. Ethan signed back. She's worried about something important. Finish your spelling. He turned off the stove and sat down across from Natalie, his hand still carrying the smell of tomato sauce and garlic. Let's say I believe you. Let's say everything you've told me is true. What exactly do you think I can do? I'm a mechanic in a town most people can't find on a map. I don't have connections anymore. I don't have credentials anyone would recognize. I don't have anything that would make your board take me seriously. You have something better. You have proof. Natalie reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet, placing it on the table between them. This is the engineering analysis for the TX9 production line. I've read it a dozen times and something is wrong. The math looks right. The simulations pass all the standard tests. But my instincts are screaming that we're missing something critical. The same way we missed it with TX7. I need someone who can see what I'm not seeing. Someone who understands the actual physics instead of just the computer models. You want me to review your engineering analysis. I want you to tell me if I'm right to be worried. And if I am, I want you to help me understand exactly what we're dealing with. Natalie's voice dropped, becoming almost confessional. The people who work for me have careers to protect and mortgages to pay. They tell me what they think I want to hear or what their department heads want them to say. You don't owe me anything. You have every reason to hate my company and everyone associated with it. If you tell me the analysis is sound, I'll believe you. And if you tell me it's not, I'll believe that too. Ethan sat with the weight of the request, feeling the familiar pull of a problem that needed solving. He'd spent 8 years convincing himself that part of his brain was dead, that the engineer inside him had been buried along with Marcus Webb and his own ambition. But the truth was more complicated. The engineer was still there, still hungry, still capable of seeing patterns others missed. The problem wasn't that he couldn't help. The problem was that helping meant opening doors he'd sealed shut for reasons that had kept him and Sophie safe. Sophie signed to him again. "Are you going to help her, Daddy?" He looked at his daughter, at the trust and curiosity in her eyes, at the spelling words scattered across the table in her careful handwriting. Then he looked at Natalie Hartwell, at the tablet containing an engineering analysis that might hide another Marcus Webb waiting to happen, at the possibility that silence was just another form of complicity. "I'll look at it tonight, after Sophie goes to bed. That's all I'm promising. That's all I'm asking." Natalie stood to leave, gathering her bag and tablet. At the door, she paused and looked back at Sophie. "Thank you for letting me visit your home. You have very nice drawings on the refrigerator." Sophie studied her for a long moment, then signed something to her father. Ethan translated with a hint of a smile. "She says your smile reaches your eyes now. She thinks maybe you are not so bad after all." Natalie blinked, and for just a moment the mask of corporate composure cracked entirely. She nodded once, quickly, and walked out into the evening before emotion could undermine the control she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Ethan closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of decisions settling onto his shoulders like old familiar armor. He looked at the tablet she'd left on the table, at the engineering analysis waiting to be examined, at the choice between safety and complicity that he'd thought he'd made 8 years ago, but apparently needed to make again. He made dinner, helped Sophie with her bath, read her a story in sign language about a girl who could talk to animals, and tucked her into bed with the small nightlight she still needed, even though she couldn't hear the sounds that frightened other children in the dark. Only when the house was quiet did he return to the kitchen table, open the tablet, and begin to read. The numbers told a story that made his blood run cold. He worked through the night, checking calculations, cross-referencing specifications, mapping failure scenarios with the same methodical precision he'd learned at MIT and refined through 5 years of real-world engineering before everything fell apart. By 3 in the morning, he'd filled an entire notebook with observations, equations, pressure curves, and probability calculations. By dawn, he understood exactly what Natalie Hartwell had sensed, but couldn't articulate. The TX-9 wasn't just similar to the TX-7, it was worse. The engineers had made modifications to increase efficiency, pushing the operational parameters higher to squeeze more productivity from the same basic design. They'd increased the hydraulic pressure tolerance from 3,000 to 3,500 psi. They'd extended the temperature range from -5 Celsius to 50 Celsius. They'd added an automatic bypass valve to speed up cycle times. Each modification looked reasonable in isolation. Together, they created a cascade of potential failure points that the standard simulations weren't designed to catch. Under normal operating conditions, the TX-9 would perform flawlessly. Under stress, under the kind of sustained load that occurred during peak production periods, the pressure differentials would compound in ways the mathematical models couldn't predict, because the models assumed steady-state conditions that never existed in actual manufacturing environments. Temperature fluctuations, load variations, material inconsistencies. The system would compensate for each individually. But when they combined, when 3 or 4 variables shifted simultaneously, the compensation mechanisms would interfere with each other, creating resonance feedback that would build faster than operators could detect or safety systems could prevent. It was the same fundamental error that had killed Marcus Webb, dressed up in new technology and wrapped in reassuring data that looked perfect on paper and would fail catastrophically in reality. Ethan picked up his phone at 7:15 in the morning and called the number on Natalie Hartwell's business card. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. "I found it. You're right to be worried. The analysis is fundamentally flawed in ways that won't show up until someone dies." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Natalie spoke, her voice carried an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. "How bad? Bad enough that I need to show you in person. Can you come back today? I'll be there in 90 minutes. She made it in 75. Ethan met her at the door with notebook in hand, and the weight of Marcus Webb's death pressing against his chest like physical force. Sophie was still asleep, so they sat at the kitchen table in the quiet gray light of morning while Ethan walked her through his analysis point by point, explaining how the TX-9's efficiency improvements had created a perfect storm of failure conditions waiting for the right combination of stress factors to align. The simulations assume steady-state conditions. He spread his handwritten notes across the table, technical diagrams intersecting with pressure curves and probability calculations. But real-world production environments don't work that way. You get temperature fluctuations, load variations, material inconsistencies that fall within acceptable tolerances individually, but combine to create conditions outside the simulation parameters. The system compensates for each of these individually, but when they compound, when 3 or 4 variables shift simultaneously, the compensation mechanisms interfere with each other. That's when you get resonance feedback. Natalie repeated the words as if testing their weight. The system starts fighting itself. Pressure builds in ways the sensors can't detect because they're calibrated for normal operations. By the time anyone realizes something is wrong, you're already past the point where safe shutdown is possible. Ethan tapped a particularly dense section of his notes. This is exactly what happened with the TX7, and the modifications they've made to the TX9 actually make it more susceptible, not less, because they've pushed every parameter closer to its breaking point while assuming ideal conditions that don't exist. Natalie stared at the calculations, her face pale in the morning light. How long do we have if the line goes into full production on schedule? Maybe 6 weeks before something fails. Maybe less, depending on operating conditions and maintenance quality and pure luck. Ethan met her eyes across the table. But here's the thing, Natalie. I can see the problem. I can explain the problem. But fixing it requires access to the actual systems, to the engineering team, to proprietary data and equipment I don't have. I'm sitting here in my kitchen drawing diagrams while the people who actually control the machinery are 300 miles away in Portland, making decisions I can't influence. Then come with me. Come to Portland. Work directly with the team. The word came out sharper than Ethan intended, cutting through the technical discussion like a knife. No. Natalie's expression shifted from hope to confusion. But I told you before, I'm not going back to that world. I can't. Ethan stood up from the table, needing distance from the analysis and the memories it triggered. I have a daughter who needs me. I have a life here that's small and quiet and safe. I can't abandon everything because your company is about to make the same mistake twice. I'm not asking you to abandon anything. I'm asking you to help me save lives. Natalie's voice cracked slightly, the first real break in her composure. I know I have no right to ask this. I know what my company did to you, what my father's decisions cost you. But I'm not my father. I'm trying to do the right thing, and I'm running out of time. The TX9 launches in 6 weeks. If we don't fix it, someone will die, and their family will get a phone call, just like Marcus Webb's family did. And I'll have to live with knowing I could have prevented it, but didn't try hard enough. The silence that followed carried the weight of 8 years and at least 1 death, and all the choices that had brought them to this kitchen table in a rental house in Oregon, where a 7-year-old girl slept peacefully, unaware that her father was being asked to become someone he'd stopped being a long time ago. Ethan's fingers traced the calculations one more time, searching for an error he knew didn't exist. The mathematics were merciless in their clarity. 6 weeks, maybe less. He pushed the notebook across the table toward Natalie with the finality of closing a case file that should never have been opened. I have conditions. Natalie straightened, and something like hope flickered across her exhaustion. Name them. No job title, no employment contract, no official position of any kind. I consult remotely from here. I provide analysis, recommendations, technical documentation. But I never set foot in your headquarters, never attend meetings, never put my name on anything that could be traced back to me. Done. No press, no publicity, no redemption story for your corporate image. If this works, if we actually prevent another death, my name stays buried exactly where it's been for 8 years. I can make that happen. And I get final say over how my analysis is used. Ethan's voice hardened into something that allowed no negotiation. If you ask me to sign off on something I think is dangerous, if you pressure me to compromise on safety for any reason, I walk away immediately and you never contact me again. Natalie nodded slowly, understanding that these weren't conditions but survival mechanisms built from scar tissue. Anything else? If I do this, it's not because I trust you or your company. It's not because I believe you're different from everyone else who's made promises they didn't keep. Sophie told me yesterday that I need to be brave even when I'm scared. 7 years old and she understands courage better than most adults. I'm doing this because I can't live with myself if someone else dies knowing I could have prevented it. But make no mistake, the moment this endangers my daughter's stability or safety, I'm gone. I understand. The words hung between them for 3 heartbeats before Ethan spoke again. No, you don't. Not yet. But you will. The work began that afternoon with the arrival of equipment Natalie had shipped overnight. A Lenovo ThinkPad workstation with specifications that would have made Ethan's MIT professors weep with envy, 2 27-inch monitors, and an encrypted VPN router that created a secure tunnel directly into Hartwell Industries' engineering servers. The setup process took 4 hours, most of which Ethan spent ensuring that every access point was logged, every file transfer tracked, every digital footprint documented with the paranoia of someone who'd watched evidence disappear once before. Sophie helped in the way 7-year-olds help, mostly by asking questions in sign language about what each wire connected to and whether the computers could talk to each other and if the screens showed secret information. Ethan answered patiently while his hands worked, grateful for her presence, even as part of his mind calculated the risk he was introducing into their carefully constructed safety. The contract arrived via email an hour before dinner. 15 pages of legal language that boiled down to $150 per hour, paid bi-weekly, with mutual non-disclosure agreements that bound both parties to silence about the work being performed. Ethan read every word twice before signing, not because he expected fairness from corporate lawyers, but because he needed to understand exactly which cage he was stepping into this time. The first phone call came at 8:30 that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep with her stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. Natalie's face appeared on the laptop screen, professional, but showing the edges of strain around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. I'm sending you access credentials for the TX9 engineering repository. Everything we have, design documents, simulation results, supplier specifications, maintenance protocols, even the emails between the engineering team and Carver's office. The password is Rachel 2016. Ethan felt something twist in his chest at hearing his dead wife's name spoken as a security credential. You know what you're doing? I'm trusting you completely, which apparently is something I haven't done with anyone since my father died, and I discovered that half the people calling themselves my advisors were actually reporting to board members who wanted me replaced. Trust is a dangerous thing in our respective positions. Then let's both try not to abuse it. Natalie's expression softened fractionally. How's Sophie handling the new equipment in the house? She thinks the computers are magic boxes that know secrets. She's not entirely wrong. The download began at 9 o'clock and ran until 3 in the morning. 847 pages of technical documentation, 12 gigabytes of CAD files showing the TX9 assembly from every conceivable angle, 96 hours of simulation logs, and 7 months of email correspondence between engineers who knew something was wrong but lacked either the authority or the courage to say so clearly. Ethan read through the night, his eyes burning from screen glare, his mind cataloging failure modes and probability distributions, and the particular kind of willful blindness that occurred when career advancement required not seeing obvious danger. By dawn, he had filled 60 pages of his notebook with observations, cross-references, and the growing certainty that the TX9 wasn't just flawed, but actively dangerous in ways that should have been caught by any competent review process, which meant either the reviewers were incompetent or they'd been told what conclusions to reach before they began their analysis. The second option that seemed infinitely more likely. The pattern repeated itself across the following weeks. Ethan would work his shift at Bennett's Repair, return home to make dinner and help Sophie with homework, read her stories until she fell asleep, then descend into the engineering analysis until his eyes could no longer focus and his brain demanded rest. 60 to 70 hours per week spent reconstructing the TX9's failure scenarios, running independent simulations with Python scripts and MATLAB models that tested conditions the official analysis had conveniently ignored. The phone calls with Natalie became longer, stretching from technical discussions about thermal expansion coefficients and pressure sensor calibration into territory that had nothing to do with hydraulics or cascade failures. She told him about growing up as Gerald Hartwell's daughter, about the unspoken expectation that she would marry someone suitable and produce grandchildren, while men with actual competence ran the company her father had built. About returning from business school to find that her father had appointed Vincent Carver as his successor in waiting, a decision she learned about from the Wall Street Journal rather than from Gerald himself. About the 18 months since his death spent trying to prove she deserved the position she'd inherited, while board members traded knowing glances that said she was temporary, a placeholder until someone serious could take control. Ethan found himself sharing details he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The way Rachel used to laugh at his terrible jokes, throwing her head back with complete abandon in a world that rarely allowed either of them such freedom. The morning he'd found her car wrapped around a telephone pole 3 miles from their apartment, the rain still falling on twisted metal and shattered glass, and the sudden absence of everything that had made his life feel real. The first time Sophie had signed "I love you" to him, her small hands forming the words with the same earnestness Rachel had shown in her final voicemail, the one Ethan had saved and still couldn't bring himself to delete. The work consumed him in ways he'd forgotten work could. This wasn't replacing hydraulic seals or diagnosing electrical faults. This was pure problem solving at the intersection of physics and mathematics and human fallibility. The intellectual challenge he'd abandoned when abandoning his career seemed like the price of keeping Sophie safe. Part of him resented how alive it made him feel. The rest of him couldn't stop. Sophie noticed. Children always noticed, especially children who'd learned to read emotion in the set of shoulders and the tension in hands because sound offered them no clues. She began leaving small drawings on his workstation, stick figures of a man at a computer, a girl with a stuffed elephant, a woman with long hair who might have been her mother, or might have been someone else entirely. Ethan kept them all, tucking them into his notebook, a book where technical diagrams gave way to crayon artwork that reminded him why the mathematics mattered. 3 weeks into the analysis, Sophie got sick. It started as a cold, the normal childhood ailment that required extra tissues and earlier bedtimes, but by the second day, her fever had climbed to 103, and she lay on the couch with the vacant stare of a child whose body was fighting battles she couldn't understand. Ethan canceled his shift at Bennett's and spent 2 days administering children's acetaminophen, making soup she barely ate, and watching her sleep with the hypervigilance of a parent who'd already lost one person who mattered and couldn't survive losing another. On the third night, Sophie seized, not dramatically, not with the convulsions television taught people to expect, but with a subtle stiffening of her limbs and a blank expression that lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but felt like drowning. Ethan grabbed his phone and keys and had her in the emergency room at Sacred Heart Medical Center within 12 minutes, his own hands shaking so badly the intake nurse asked if he needed to sit down. The ER doctor was young, maybe 30, with the calm competence of someone who'd seen worse and knew how to triage actual emergencies from parental panic. Febrile seizure, common in children under 8 with high fevers, scary as hell for parents but rarely dangerous. We'll get her fever down, run some tests to make sure there's no underlying infection, and she'll be fine. Ethan sat in the plastic chair beside Sophie's bed while nurses drew blood and checked vital signs, his mind replaying the seizure on loop and calculating all the ways a 7-year-old deaf girl could be injured by something she couldn't hear coming. The rational part of his brain knew the doctor was right. The irrational part wanted to wrap Sophie in protective layers thick enough to shield her from every danger the world might deploy. 4 hours later, they were home. Sophie's fever broken by antibiotics and her energy already returning in small bursts of curiosity about the hospital equipment. Ethan tucked her into bed, signed "I love you" against her forehead in the gesture they'd developed over years of navigating silence together, and collapsed onto his own bed without bothering to change clothes. He woke at 2 in the morning to find Sophie standing beside his bed, her stuffed elephant clutched in one hand and her other hand gently shaking his shoulder. He signed, "What's wrong? Are you sick again?" She shook her head and climbed onto the bed beside him, settling against his chest with the boneless trust of childhood. Then she began signing slowly with the careful precision of someone who'd been thinking about her words for hours. "Daddy, why did you stop helping the shoe lady?" "I didn't stop. I'm still helping her, but you're sad when you work, and you don't smile like you used to smile with mommy. The observation landed with surgical accuracy. Ethan wrapped his arm around his daughter and signed with his free hand. The work is important. It helps keep people safe. But it also makes me remember things that hurt. Like when mommy died? Yes, like that. Sophie was quiet for a moment, her small body warm against his. Then she signed again, and the words hit him harder than any engineering calculation. If you don't help, someone else will be like mommy. They'll die and never come back. I don't want other kids to lose their mommy or daddy like I lost mommy. Ethan felt tears burn his eyes in the darkness. You're right. That's exactly why I have to help, even though it scares me. Being brave is doing things even when you're scared. You told me that. I did. So you have to be brave like you taught me to be brave. Sophie's hands moved with absolute certainty. The shoe lady needs you, and daddy always helps people who need help. The wisdom of 7 years old, spoken through hands that had never produced sound, but communicated truths adults spent lifetimes trying to articulate. Ethan held his daughter until she fell asleep against his shoulder. And in the silence that was her world and had become his, he made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff while hoping someone had built a bridge below. The next morning, he called Natalie before coffee, before rationality could reassert itself, and convince him that safety was worth more than principle. I need to see the archived files from 2016, not just the engineering documents you have already sent. Everything, emails, internal memos, chat logs, performance reviews, whatever exists in your system about the TX7 investigation and the aftermath. That's going to take time to compile. Some of those records are locked in legacy systems. We don't have time. The TX9 launches in 3 weeks. Ethan paced his small kitchen while dawn broke over Maple Ridge, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber that would have been beautiful if he'd had attention left for beauty. I need those files now, and I need to search them in person where I can cross-reference documents that might not be digitized, which means I'm coming to Portland. The silence on the other end of the phone stretches long enough for Ethan to wonder if the connection had dropped. Then Natalie spoke, her voice careful. You said you'd never come to Portland, never set foot in my headquarters. I said a lot of things. My daughter convinced me that being brave means doing necessary things even when they terrify you. So I'm coming to Portland for 3 days. But I have conditions beyond what we've already agreed. Tell me, Sophie comes with me. I don't leave her in Oregon, not even with people I trust. We stay in a hotel, not your house or company housing. I don't meet anyone except you. If I feel unsafe at any point, we leave immediately and this ends. And you hire private security to ensure Sophie's protection while we're there. Done. All of it. Natalie's response came without hesitation. I'll book 2 connecting suites at the Fairmont downtown. I'll hire the best security firm in Portland. I'll make sure you have access to every file we possess. Just tell me when. Tuesday. We fly Tuesday morning. Ethan ended the call and stood looking at the kitchen table where Sophie's homework lay scattered beside his technical notebooks. Evidence of 2 lives intersecting in a rented house where a man who'd stopped being an engineer tried to remember how to be one without destroying what remained of his carefully constructed safety. The tablet Natalie had left weeks ago sat dark and silent, but Ethan could feel its weight like a third presence in the room. He was going back to Portland, back to the city where his career had imploded and his wife had died, and every street corner held memories of the person he'd been before loss and failure had ground him down to something smaller and sadder and so much more careful. He was taking Sophie into potential danger because she'd been the one brave enough to say what he'd been avoiding. That silence was its own form of complicity, and sometimes the only way to protect the people you loved was to step between them and the machinery that ground up human lives in service of quarterly profits. The flight to Portland took 90 minutes on Alaska Airlines. Sophie pressed against the window, watching clouds scroll past like frozen landscapes, while Ethan reviewed his notes one final time. The security agent Natalie had hired met them at baggage claim. Marcus Chen, 42, former Secret Service with the professional alertness of someone who'd spent years watching for threats in crowds. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that communicated competence without aggression. I have a 9-year-old daughter. I understand what's at stake here. Nobody touches the kid, Nobody gets close enough to make her uncomfortable. And if you want to leave at any point, we leave. No questions, no delays. The reassurance settled something in Ethan's chest that had been vibrating with tension since they'd left Oregon. Sophie studied Marcus with the careful assessment she deployed toward all new adults, then signed to her father. He has kind eyes. Ethan translated, and Marcus smiled before replying directly to Sophie with slow, clear enunciation. Thank you, I promise to keep you safe. The Fairmont occupied 12 floors of glass and steel in downtown Portland, its lobby decorated in chrome and marble that suggested wealth without ostentation. The connecting suites on the 8th floor faced west toward the Willamette River, offering views of water and bridges and the distant peaks of the Cascade Range. Sophie explored both rooms with the enthusiasm of a child for whom hotel stays were rare adventures, testing the firmness of beds and examining the minibar with intense curiosity about why anyone would store candy in a refrigerator. Natalie arrived at 6 o'clock carrying a leather briefcase and a Lego set that depicted a complex mechanical assembly of gears and hydraulic pistons. She offered it to Sophie without preamble. I thought you might like this while your dad is working. Sophie's eyes widened at the intricate pieces visible through the box's clear window. She signed her thanks with the same careful formality she used for gifts from adults she hadn't fully evaluated, then carried the set to the coffee table and began opening it with surgical precision. Ethan watched the exchange with something that might have been the beginning of trust. You didn't have to do that. I know. But she's 7 and she's in a strange city because her father is helping me fix a problem that shouldn't exist. The least I can do is give her something to build while we tear apart 8 years of corporate malfeasance. Natalie set her briefcase on the dining table and opened it to reveal a tablet loaded with access credentials. The archived server is live. Everything from 2015 through 2017. Almost 12,000 emails, 400 internal memos, chat logs from the engineering team, and HR files for everyone who worked at Apex during that period. I've arranged for food to be delivered every 3 hours, so you don't have to leave the suite. Marcus is stationed in the hallway and will remain there until you tell him otherwise. How much of this have you read? Enough to know my father was directly involved in the cover-up. Beyond that, I've been waiting for you to help me understand the full scope. They worked through the evening while Sophie assembled Lego mechanisms on the floor, occasionally glancing up to watch the adults stare at screens with the intensity of people searching for evidence that might save lives or end careers depending on what they found. Ethan navigated the archived emails with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that truth hid in the spaces between official statements, in the messages that were never meant to survive corporate document retention policies. The first smoking gun appeared at 11:30 p.m., an email from Vincent Carver to Apex Dynamics' chief financial officer dated April 3, 2016, 14 days before Marcus Webb died. The subject line read, TX7 launch timeline, risk assessment. Ethan read it aloud, his voice flat with the effort of keeping emotion from overwhelming analysis. Mercer's concerns about resonance feedback are technically valid based on worst-case scenario modeling. However, implementing his recommended modifications would require 4 months of additional testing at a cost of $2.1 million. Given that the Peterson contract specifies Q2 delivery with substantial penalties for delay, and given that worst-case conditions have less than 0.05% probability during normal operations, I recommend we proceed with launch as scheduled. We can mitigate risk through enhanced operator training and additional warning signage at critical pressure points. Natalie had gone pale. He knew. Carver knew you were right and chose profit over safety. That's not even the worst part. Ethan pulled up a second email, this one from the chief financial officer's response 2 hours later. Agreed. The Peterson contract represents 18% of annual revenue for Apex. We cannot afford to lose it. Proceed with launch. Authorize additional training budget of $75,000 to address Mercer's concerns without delaying production. They valued Marcus Webb's life at $75,000 in training materials. The second smoking gun came at 2 in the morning. Internal chat logs between 3 engineers dated April 15th, 10 days before the accident. The conversation was time-stamped and preserved in a database that someone had neglected to purge when Apex Dynamics was folded into Hartwell Industries operations. Did anyone follow up on Mercer's cascade failure scenario? Carver shut it down in yesterday's meeting, said it was hypothetical worst-case thinking that ignored operational realities. But the math checks out. I ran independent simulations using different thermal models and got similar results. If we hit sustained high-load conditions during a heat wave with degraded valve performance, drop it. Carver made clear that anyone slowing this launch will be restructured. I've got a mortgage and 2 kids in college. I can't afford to be the hero who gets fired for being right. The conversation ended there. 3 engineers who understood the danger but valued their paychecks more than the life of a man whose name they probably didn't know until the accident report listed him as operator error. Ethan stood and walked to the window, looking out at Portland's lights scattered across the river valley like fallen stars. Behind him, he heard Natalie move papers, gathering evidence into categories that would matter when the time came to present it to people whose careers depended on maintaining the fiction that everything had been done correctly. There's more. Her voice was quiet, hesitant in a way it hadn't been before. An email from my father. I found it yesterday and I needed you here to help me understand what it means. She handed him a printout, and Ethan recognized the header from Gerald Hartwell's executive account. The date was May 2nd, 2 days after Marcus Webb's funeral. The recipient was Vincent Carver. The subject line was simply containment. Vincent, ensure the Mercer situation is handled appropriately. Legal is managing the Webb family settlement and NDA. Make certain no one from the engineering team speaks to external investigators or media. I want this incident completely contained. If we lose the Peterson contract over this accident, there will be consequences for everyone in the decision chain. The official investigation will conclude operator error. Make sure your people understand that this conclusion is not negotiable. Gerald. Ethan read the email 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of calculated cruelty. Your father didn't just know about the cover-up. He ordered it. He threatened everyone in the decision chain to ensure they maintained the lie that Marcus Webb died because of his own incompetence rather than because executives chose profit over safety. Natalie sat down heavily in the desk chair, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence that her father had been not just flawed, but actively malicious. I always knew he was ruthless, but I thought he was ruthless in service of building something valuable. I thought the hard decisions he made were necessary for keeping 5,000 people employed, for maintaining contracts that fed families. I didn't understand that he was willing to let people die rather than admit mistakes. People rarely do understand that until they see it documented in emails that were supposed to be deleted. Ethan returned to his laptop, pulling up the search interface for the archive server. Now we need to find out if Carver created the fake peer review report in 2016, or if someone else did it for him. Because if we can prove the report was fabricated to discredit my analysis, we have criminal fraud in addition to negligent homicide. They searched until dawn, Sophie sleeping peacefully in the bedroom, while her father and a woman she'd initially distrusted as the shoe lady's fool assembled a case that would destroy careers and reputations and possibly trigger federal investigations into corporate malfeasance. By 6 a.m., they had found the evidence. Email exchanges between Carver and an outside consulting firm that specialized in producing independent technical assessments for companies facing litigation. The proposal explicitly mentioned creating a peer review document that would cast doubt on internal whistleblower claims and provide defensible basis for proceeding with production timeline. The peer review report had been purchased like any other corporate service, manufactured to order by consultants who knew what conclusions their client needed and had no ethical qualms about providing them. Ethan compiled everything into a single encrypted file. The smoking gun emails, the chat logs, the fabricated peer review, the timeline showing that every decision maker had known about the danger and chosen to ignore it. Then he wrote a technical summary explaining how the TX9 design contained the same flaws that had killed Marcus Webb, only amplified by modifications that pushed every safety margin closer to catastrophic failure. 18 specific changes required to prevent another death. Cost estimates for each modification. Implementation timeline if they started immediately. It was the most thorough condemnation of corporate negligence he'd ever assembled, and it would either save lives or end his involvement with Hartwell Industries permanently depending on how Natalie chose to deploy it. She read through the document while Ethan made coffee in the suite's kitchenette, his hands moving on autopilot while his brain ran probability calculations for how the board would respond to evidence that one of their senior executives had orchestrated a cover-up with the founder's explicit approval. The mathematics weren't encouraging. Institutions protected themselves. Whistleblowers got destroyed. These were laws as reliable as thermodynamics. I'm presenting this to the board on Friday. Emergency session. Natalie looked up from the tablet, her expression carrying the weight of someone preparing for battle without certainty of survival. Carver will fight back. He'll claim the emails are taken out of context, that the technical concerns were addressed through training, that you're a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. The board will want to believe him because accepting your analysis means admitting the company has been operating under criminal negligence for 8 years. Then you'll lose. Probably. But I'm going to try anyway, because Sophie was right about being brave when you're scared. Natalie stood, gathering her materials with the decisive movements of someone who'd made peace with consequences. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Ethan set down his coffee mug and waited. If the board rejects your analysis, if they vote to proceed with the TX9 launch despite everything we found, what will you do? The question hung in the air between them like a blade balanced on edge. Ethan thought about Marcus Webb's daughters, about Sophie sleeping in the next room, about all the people whose names he'd never know who would clock in for their shifts at whatever facility installed the TX9 and trust that someone had built the machinery to keep them safe. I'll go to the press with everything we found, the emails, the fake report, the technical analysis. I'll contact OSHA directly with proof that their original investigation was compromised. I'll burn whatever bridges I have left if it means preventing another death. Even if it means exposing yourself, destroying the anonymity you've built, especially then. Because the only thing worse than being destroyed for telling the truth is staying silent while people die because I was too afraid to speak. The words settled between them with the finality of an oath, and Natalie nodded slowly as if she'd been testing something and found it solid enough to bear weight. Then let's make sure it doesn't come to that. The boardroom occupied the entire 23rd floor of Hartwell Industries' Portland headquarters, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Willamette River and the bridge spans crossing it like steel threads stitching the city together. 12 leather chairs surrounded a table of polished walnut that probably cost more than Ethan had earned in his entire tenure at Apex Dynamics. He watched the proceedings via encrypted video feed from his hotel suite, Sophie building elaborate Lego structures beside him, while her father observed the dismantling of reputations and the defensive careers built on bodies nobody wanted to acknowledge. Natalie stood at the head of the table, a presentation remote in one hand and 8 years of buried truth in the other. The board members filed in with the careful neutrality of people who suspected the meeting would be unpleasant, but hadn't yet calculated which side of the conflict would serve their interest better. Vincent Carver entered last, his posture carrying the confidence of someone who'd survived corporate politics for 2 decades and didn't expect a 31-year-old CEO to present meaningful threat. Thank you all for coming on short notice. I've discovered evidence regarding the 2016 incident at Apex Dynamics that has direct bearing on the TX9 launch currently scheduled for 3 weeks from today. Carver leaned back in his chair with the studied casualness of dismissal. If this is about the discredited engineer you've been consulting, I think we've established that Ethan Mercer's analysis was reviewed by independent experts and found wanting. The experts you're referring to never existed. Natalie pressed a button and the wall screen behind her lit with an email timestamped April 2016. This is correspondence between your office and Kendrick Technical Consulting, a firm that specializes in producing litigation defense documents. You paid them $47,000 to fabricate a peer review report that would discredit Mr. Mercer's safety analysis. The report you presented to this board last month contains signatures from 3 engineers, 2 of whom had retired before the TX7 project began, and 1 who died in 2015. The report is fraudulent. The silence that followed had texture, like atmosphere thickening before a storm. The chief financial officer, a woman in her 50s who'd served under Gerald Hartwell for 15 years, spoke first. Those are serious allegations, which is why I'm prepared to provide documentation for every claim. Natalie advanced to the next slide, an email from Carver to Apex's CFO acknowledging that Ethan's concerns were technically valid, but recommending they proceed anyway to avoid delaying the Peterson contract. She let them read it, watch their faces process the implications, then continued to the chat logs showing engineers being threatened into silence. Vincent, would you like to explain why you knowingly overrode safety recommendations that subsequently resulted in a worker fatality? Carver's composure fractured at the edges but held. Context matters, Natalie. We made calculated risk assessments based on operational probability. The worst-case scenarios Mr. Mercer modeled had less than 0.05% likelihood under normal conditions. Marcus Webb died under those normal conditions. Natalie's voice stayed level through visible effort. And now you're proposing to launch the TX9, which contains the same fundamental design flaws amplified by modifications that increase pressure tolerances beyond safe operational margins. I have a complete technical analysis demonstrating that the TX9 will fail under sustained load conditions within 6 to 8 weeks of launch. The analysis was performed by Mr. Mercer, the same engineer whose concerns you buried 8 years ago, because admitting he was right would have cost the company money and cost you personally your reputation as someone who delivers projects on schedule. If we delay this launch, we lose $43 million in contracted revenue and damage relationships with clients who've already committed to integration timelines. Carver looked around the table, making eye contact with board members who understood profit margins better than pressure coefficients. We have a responsibility to shareholders and to the 5,000 employees whose jobs depend on maintaining our competitive position. We have a responsibility not to kill people. One of the board members, an elderly man who'd served with Gerald Hartwell since the company's founding, cleared his throat. What would this delay cost us in real terms? 4 months and $12 million to implement the safety modifications. Lost revenue from contract delays will depend on how many clients we can convince to adjust their schedules. In worst case, we could be looking at 60 to 70 million in total impact. And if we proceed with launch as scheduled, someone will die. Natalie's certainty left no room for probabilistic hedging. Not might die, will die. The TX9's failure modes are not edge cases. They're inevitable outcomes of sustained high-load operation under realistic manufacturing conditions. I have documentation proving that everyone in the decision chain knew this, chose to ignore it, and then covered up the evidence when the predicted failure killed Marcus Webb. If we launch this system knowing it's unsafe, we are criminally liable. Board members could face personal prosecution for negligent homicide. The general counsel, a sharp-eyed attorney who'd spent 30 years protecting Hartwell Industries from litigation, spoke for the first time. Personal liability changes the calculation substantially. If the prosecution can demonstrate we had knowledge of dangers and proceeded anyway, the corporate veil won't protect individual board members, which is exactly why this girl's manufacturing a crisis. Carver stood, his professional veneer cracking to reveal something harder underneath. She's been trying to discredit me since she took over, trying to dismantle everything her father built because she doesn't understand how manufacturing actually works. Gerald Hartwell made tough decisions that kept this company profitable through 3 recessions. He understood that calculated risks are necessary. His daughter wants to turn Hartwell Industries into a nonprofit that prioritizes feelings over financial reality. My father ordered a cover-up that let a man die and destroyed the career of the engineer who tried to prevent it. Natalie's composure finally cracked, letting through the anger she'd been containing. I have his emails, Vincent. I have Gerald Hartwell's direct instructions to ensure the Mercer situation was contained, to threaten anyone who might speak to investigators, to make certain the official conclusion was operator error, regardless of evidence. My father wasn't making tough decisions. He was committing crimes, and you were his accomplice. She advanced to the final slide. Gerald's email with its explicit orders for containment and its threat of consequences for anyone in the decision chain. The board members read in silence that extended beyond comfort into something approaching horror. The vote when it came was closer than Ethan had hoped. 8 members in favor of delaying the launch, 3 opposed, 1 abstaining. Carver's termination passed with similar margins, the board apparently willing to sacrifice him to protect themselves from the criminal liability Natalie had outlined with lawyerly precision. Ethan watched Vincent Carver gather his materials and leave the boardroom. His 20 years at Hartwell Industries ending in the time it took to collect a briefcase and laptop. No dramatic exit, no threats, just the quiet erasure of a career built on compromises that had seemed defensible until someone assembled the receipts proving they'd never been anything but murder, dressed in cost-benefit analysis. The video feed cut out as the meeting adjourned. Ethan sat staring at the blank screen, feeling something that wasn't quite victory and wasn't quite relief. Sophie looked up from her Lego assembly and signed, "Is it over?" He signed back. "Part of it. We prevented the bad thing from happening. So the people are safe now?" "Yes, the people are safe." Sophie nodded with the satisfied certainty of someone who'd believed all along that her father could fix broken things if he tried hard enough. She returned to her building, connecting gears and hydraulic pieces with the same careful attention Ethan had once applied to machinery before machines had betrayed him too many times to trust completely. Natalie arrived at the suite 40 minutes later, her professional armor showing cracks where exhaustion leaked through. She'd won, but winning looked like it had cost her pieces of herself she hadn't planned on spending. Ethan let her in without words, understanding that some battles left you too depleted for conversation. "Carver's gone. The TX-9 launch is delayed. The modifications will begin Monday." Her voice was hollow, evacuated of the energy that had carried her through the presentation. "I just fired a man who worked for my father longer than I've been alive. I publicly accused my dead father of criminal behavior. And I still don't know if I did the right thing or just destroyed what he built. You saved lives. That's the right thing. Tell that to the employees who'll lose their jobs if we can't recover the client relationships Carver was right about. Tell that to shareholders who'll see their stock prices drop when word gets out that we've delayed a major product launch. Tell that to my father's memory, which I just dragged through the mud in front of people who worshipped him." Ethan poured her a glass of water from the suite's kitchenette, the simple domestic gesture feeling inadequate against the magnitude of what she was processing. "Your father made choices that killed someone. You made choices that prevented more deaths. The math isn't complicated, even if the feelings are." Sophie had been watching the exchange with the particular attention she gave to adult distress, reading emotion and posture and gesture the way other children read picture books. She approached Natalie slowly, carrying something she'd been building. A small Lego crane with a functional hydraulic lift. She held it out like an offering, signing to her father to translate. Ethan's hands moved. "She says you look sad. She made this for you because cranes are strong and they lift heavy things. She thinks you're strong like a crane." Natalie took the Lego construction with hands that trembled slightly, and for the first time since entering the suite, her professional mask dissolved completely. She knelt to Sophie's height, maintaining eye contact in the way the girl had been teaching her over weeks of careful observation. "Thank you. This is the nicest thing anyone's given me in a very long time." Her voice cracked on the last words, and Sophie reached out to pat her shoulder with the solemn comfort children offer when they recognize authentic pain. Ethan watched the moment extend between his daughter and the woman who'd driven 3 hours to find him in a repair shop because she needed someone who understood how machines failed and systems collapsed and people died when profit mattered more than safety. Something shifted in his chest, a wall he'd built after Rachel died, developing fissures that let through light he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The evening descended into something almost domestic. Dinner ordered from a downtown restaurant that specialized in foods Sophie would actually eat. Conversation that stayed carefully away from boardrooms and failure analysis. Natalie learning signs for delicious and thank you and tomorrow, while Sophie patiently corrected her grammar. They watched a documentary about deep-sea creatures that required no sound to appreciate, Sophie fascinated by bioluminescent jellyfish, while Natalie's exhaustion gradually transformed into something approaching peace. After Sophie fell asleep, Ethan and Natalie sat on the suite's small balcony, watching Portland's lights reflect off the Willamette River in scattered patterns that reminded Ethan of the constellation maps Rachel used to trace on the ceiling when they couldn't afford to go anywhere more interesting than their own bedroom. "I don't know what happens next." Natalie stared at the city spread below them like circuit diagrams made of amber and steel. "The board supported me this time because you gave them evidence they couldn't ignore and legal exposure they couldn't accept. But they're not loyal. They're afraid. Fear makes for temporary allies. so make them less afraid of you than they are of criminal prosecution. That's not sustainable. Nothing about corporate leadership is sustainable. You survive quarter to quarter until you either accumulate enough power to feel secure or you get replaced by someone willing to make the compromises you won't. Ethan felt the cold air against his face, Portland's November chill, sharper than Oregon's inland valleys. The question isn't whether you can survive indefinitely. The question is whether you're doing the right things while you have the chance. Sophie told me yesterday that I should move to Oregon, that Portland has too many people who make you sad. She's perceptive. She also said you smile more now than you did before I showed up, which I'm choosing to interpret as progress even though I've disrupted your entire life. Natalie turned to face him, her expression carrying vulnerability she clearly wasn't practiced at displaying. I know this arrangement can't continue. You consulting remotely while maintaining your life in Maple Ridge. The board will want you credentialed, titled, integrated into official channels. And I know you won't agree to that. You're right. I won't. So where does that leave us? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had explicitly acknowledged during weeks of phone calls and technical discussions, in the slow accumulation of trust between people who'd both been betrayed by systems they'd believed in. Ethan watched the river below, its current carrying water from the Cascades to the Pacific, and thought about the ways people flowed toward each other despite obstacles and better judgment. It leaves us figuring out something that probably won't work, but might be worth trying anyway. I'm not moving to Portland. This city took too much from me, and I won't put Sophie somewhere that makes her father flinch at intersections because one of them killed her mother. But Oregon has 3 hours of highway between us, which isn't insurmountable if someone's willing to drive it. I'm willing. Then we figure out the logistics like adults who want something badly enough to be inconvenienced by it. I'm not good at this. Relationships, being vulnerable, all the things that don't show up on balance sheets or get taught in business school. My father raised me to run companies, not navigate emotions. Neither am I. But Sophie seems to think you're worth the effort, and 7-year-olds are excellent judges of character. Natalie laughed, the sound surprising both of them. Your daughter is more emotionally intelligent than most executives I've worked with. That's because she has to be. The world doesn't offer accommodations for deaf children beyond legal minimums. She learned to read people because misunderstanding someone's intentions when you can't hear their tone could mean the difference between safety and danger. It made her careful, but it also made her wise in ways most children don't have to be. The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward. Two people sitting in the space between what they'd been and what they might become if they were brave enough to try. Portland sprawled below them in geometric patterns of light and shadow, evidence of human effort to organize chaos into something functional, if not always beautiful. The following morning they returned to Oregon, Sophie sleeping against Ethan's shoulder for most of the drive while he navigated familiar highways and thought about the way safety could become its own prison if you built the walls thick enough. Maple Ridge appeared through the windshield like a photograph of someone else's life, small and quiet and safe in ways that suddenly felt like limitations rather than refuge. The months that followed developed their own rhythm, pattern emerging from chaos the way crystalline structures formed under pressure and time. Natalie relocated Hartwell Industries' primary operations to Portland, close enough to Oregon that the drive became routine rather than expedition. She appeared in Maple Ridge 3 or 4 days each week, staying in a room Ethan cleared in his house after they'd established that hotel rooms were expensive and silly when what they were building required more permanence than temporary accommodation. Sophie's relationship with Natalie deepened from provisional acceptance to something approaching trust, though she never called her mother and Natalie never presumed to claim that title. They built their own language, Natalie learning sign with dedication that transformed clumsy gestures into fluent conversation, Sophie teaching patience to someone whose career had trained her to demand immediate results. They cooked together, Natalie's corporate precision translating surprisingly well to recipe execution. They visited Portland's Science Museum, where Sophie could touch everything and learn through hands rather than ears. They painted rocks for Sophie's collection, Natalie's designs geometric and precise, while Sophie's exploded with colors that had no regard for staying within lines. Ethan watched the relationship develop with the careful attention of someone who'd lost one person he loved and couldn't survive losing another. He saw the moments Natalie struggled with patience when Sophie needed something explained 3 times. He saw the moments Sophie tested boundaries to determine if this adult would stay or leave like too many others had. He saw them both trying with the earnest effort of people who recognize value in the connection they were building. The TX9 launched in February, 4 months behind schedule, and $12 million over budget, with every safety modification Ethan had specified and several additional improvements the engineering team developed once they felt safe enough to acknowledge previous design flaws. No accidents, no deaths, no emergency recalls or OSHA investigations. The machinery performed exactly as it was supposed to, reliably boring in the way safe systems should be. Marcus Chen continued his security work, but became something like a friend, someone who understood the particular anxiety of protecting children in a world that didn't offer guarantees. He taught Sophie basic situational awareness, age-appropriate ways to recognize when adults presented danger versus simply being awkward. He taught Ethan that hypervigilance was exhausting, and sometimes you had to trust that not everyone was a threat disguised as help. Vincent Carver sued for wrongful termination, his lawyers arguing that he'd been scapegoated for decisions made by multiple executives, including Gerald Hartwell himself. The case settled out of court for an undisclosed sum that Natalie never discussed, but which left her quietly furious for weeks after the papers were signed. Justice, it turned out, looked more like negotiated compromise than righteous vindication. The people with money rarely face consequences proportional to their actions. Ethan testified in a sealed deposition for the Webb family's wrongful death lawsuit, which had been revived once evidence of the cover-up became public. He sat in a conference room in Eugene and answered questions for 6 hours about what he'd known and when he'd known it and why he hadn't fought harder to prevent the death that cost 2 children their father. The lawyers were professional, but the questions cut deep, implied accusations that he'd abandoned Marcus Webb by choosing his own safety over continued advocacy. The settlement, when it came, was larger than the original, funded by Hartwell Industries liability insurance. But no amount of money returned a 34-year-old man to his daughters. Christmas arrived with snow unusual for Maple Ridge, 3 inches that transformed the town into something from a postcard no one would believe captured reality. Ethan's house smelled of pine and cookies Sophie had decorated with structural integrity that suggested engineering might run in families. Natalie had brought gifts she'd agonized over selecting: art supplies for Sophie, a leather-bound notebook for Ethan that cost too much but felt exactly right when he opened it. Sophie gave Natalie a bracelet she'd made from painted rocks, each one decorated with patterns that meant something in the private language 7-year-olds invented. Natalie wore it immediately despite its aesthetic clash with every item in her wardrobe, understanding that some gifts mattered more than fashion. Ethan gave Natalie a key. It was small and brass and completely ordinary, except for what it represented. She turned it over in her palm, studying the metal as if metallurgical analysis might reveal its purpose. Key to, here, this house. You've spent 6 months driving back and forth and staying in the guest room like a visitor. Sophie keeps asking when you're moving in properly, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. So this is me saying you don't have to be a visitor anymore. If you want to be something more permanent, there's space for that. Natalie stared at the key, then at Ethan, then at Sophie, who was watching the exchange with bright-eyed interest, even though she couldn't hear the words being spoken. What about your career? My position at Hartwell? We haven't resolved the logistics of... Logistics are problems people solve when they want something badly enough to be inconvenienced. You've proven you can run a company from Portland. I've proven I can consult remotely. Sophie's proven she can adapt to new people if they're patient enough to meet her where she is. Everything else is just details we'll figure out, because the alternative is walking away from something that works. I don't know how to be part of a family. I'm good at spreadsheets and risk assessment and firing people who endanger others. I'm terrible at domesticity and emotional availability and all the things normal relationships require. Then it's lucky we're not pursuing a normal relationship. We're pursuing whatever this is, 2 people who've both been broken by systems that cared more about profit than humanity, trying to build something that doesn't collapse under the weight of past trauma. Sophie came over with the Lego crane she'd given Natalie months earlier in Portland. Its hydraulic lift still functional despite dozens of disassembly and rebuild cycles. She signed to Natalie directly, her grammar now confident enough that Ethan's translation wasn't required. You're strong like the crane. You can lift heavy things. You can stay with us and help lift heavy things together. The wisdom of 7 years old, delivered in hands that had never known sound, but understood truth better than most adults achieved it after decades of practice. Natalie knelt beside Sophie and signed her response with the fluency that came from 6 months of dedicated study. I would like that very much. If your father and you will have me. Sophie threw her arms around Natalie's neck with the unrestrained affection of childhood, and Natalie held her with the careful intensity of someone who'd spent 31 years building walls that a deaf 7-year-old and her father had somehow convinced her to dismantle. Ethan watched them together and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since Rachel died and Marcus Webb followed her into graves dug by corporate negligence and random chance. He'd spent 8 years trying to be small enough that the world couldn't hurt him anymore, protecting Sophie by withdrawing from everything that had once given his life meaning. But safety purchased through isolation was just another form of death, slower and quieter, but no less final. Sophie had taught him that being brave meant doing necessary things even when they terrified you. Natalie had taught him that some people were worth the risk of vulnerability, despite all evidence that trust eventually betrayed. Together, they'd proven that the only thing worse than trying and failing was never trying at all and spending your life wondering what you'd been too afraid to reach for. The snow continued falling outside, covering Maple Ridge in white that would melt by morning, but for now transformed the ordinary into something approaching magic. Inside the small house where an engineer and his daughter had hidden from a world that took too much, they built something new. Imperfect and incomplete and absolutely worth the effort of construction. Somewhere in Massachusetts, the TX9 production line hummed through the night shift, its safety systems functioning exactly as specified, its operators returning home to families who would never know how close they'd come to loss. Somewhere in the archives of Hartwell Industries, emails documenting corporate negligence remain preserved as evidence that some people chose profit over lives, and some people refused to let those choices stand unchallenged. And in Maple Ridge, Oregon, 3 people who'd all been broken in different ways sat together in the warm light of Christmas evening, building something from the pieces they'd salvaged. Not perfect, never perfect, but strong enough to bear weight and flexible enough to survive the stresses that tested all structures built by human hands. The machinery of the world ground on, indifferent to individual stories. But some stories mattered anyway. Some people made choices that prevented deaths rather than causing them. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to risk trying again after everything fell apart, you found that the pieces fit together in ways that made sense, even though nothing was guaranteed, and everything remained fragile as snow falling on a December night in a town small enough that most people never noticed it existed at all.